Hello, everyone. Welcome to a chill Thursday live stream. So, for those of you out there who know who I am, you know that on Thursdays I usually like to do a show called Bad Writing, where I get various authors and storytellers together to kind of go over something that is terrible, like a TV show or movie, and talk about why it is like that. And with the start of the new year, I took a few weeks off from live streaming, and it's been really hard to kind of schedule people to do those Bad Writing live streams. So today, just to get back into the swing of things, we're going to be doing something new, which is called Salty News. And we're going to be talking about current trending news topics. So like this isn't going to be evergreen content like we usually do on the Salty Nerd podcast, but it's going to be something that we're going to kind of do just for fun and test it out, see how it works. So be sure to let me know what you think about this in the comments, and also give us a thumbs up to help us out with that algorithm. It's always very much appreciated. So what we're going to do today is we have a number of news stories that we're going to cover. And I'm not going to sit here and read you guys articles or anything like that. We're going to go through some bullet points, and we're going to talk about some stuff, discuss some stuff with some special guests. And with me today is my good friend Chris Buchagnani coming at us. I believe you live in Michigan, right? You're a big Ohio State guy.
Huge Ohio State fan. Live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Yes, sir.
Now he's coming at us from State College, Pennsylvania, our old alma mater. We're both Penn State alumni. We actually went to film school together. Ain't that right, Chris?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Yes, but you bitched out.
Yes,
I stayed until the bitter end.
Proudly so.
And now look at me now. I'm doing live streams on YouTube.
And here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my lighting is perfect. It's chef's kiss. So that degree was not wasted. God damn it. We used to have a joke. What was it? So when you graduate from law school, you're a lawyer. When you graduate from med school, you're a doctor. When you graduate from film school, you're a waiter.
Yeah. Which sometimes felt like setting the bar a little high for the film school grads.
Yeah,
Yes.
I know, right? Yeah. But Chris, so like, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself? Like, what is it you're doing out in State College? I know that you got a podcast going on out there as well. And yeah, just kind of introduce yourself to the Salty Nerd fans out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matt, I am a huge Salty Nerd Crew fan, so this is a thrill for me to be a ringer for a night. I'm glad to even be tangential to the Salty Nerd orbit. This is great. But yeah, as Matt said, I am a proud Penn State alum, proud Pennsylvanian, live here in Happy Valley, the home of Penn State University, and run a small media company here. We produce and distribute our own syndicated Penn State football pregame show that I've been doing for several years with some former Penn State football players and some media folks locally. And so that's just sort of spun out into other media. The TV show is called The Obligatory PSU Pregame Show. It just tries to take a fun, laid-back look at college football without getting too deep into the X's and O's and ESPN talking heads screaming at each other type stuff. And so we do podcasts and radio, web, digital magazines, all that kind of stuff. And I like to talk about a lot of different topics. And I think it's the last time I was on with you, Matt, I said that one time we tried to go outside our comfort zone on the podcast and talk about Game of Thrones. And it was by far our worst received, like most negative listener feedback episode in years and years. So I learned to not stray too far beyond the boundaries of the sports and Penn State football world. But I like to dip into a lot of different topics. So I appreciate the invite to come and go outside my comfort zone tonight.
Of course. Stay in your lane, goddammit. But for those of you out there who might not know, Chris and I were actually former roommates in college, lived together for a number of years. Was it you or Cam who slept on the couch with the snake inside of it?
It was Cam. And then that guy hated snakes more than Indiana Jones.
Well, we all hated snakes. I have no idea why Buffalo decided to get one as a pet. I still have traumatic nightmares about the feeding of that thing. But yeah, we had an actual snake get loose in our apartment, and it crawled underneath one of the couches and coiled around the couch springs, I guess you'd call them. And that just happened to be one of our other roommates' beds. Like he just slept on that thing like it was a bed. And he was sleeping on top of a huge snake for a number of months, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Cam's a tough dude. He's like a third-degree black belt in judo. I have seen him handle himself admirably in some pretty tense situations. I have never seen anything approaching the look of abject terror on his face when he realized he had been sleeping on top of a boa constrictor or whatever the hell that thing was. A python
Python,
for 3 months. Brutal.
Yeah, the good old college days. All right, well, enough reminiscing. Let's start talking about some actual stuff that people might really care about. But before we do, I'm going to show us our new intros. See, Chris, this is the type of professional production I run around here. I have like intros and music and all that stuff. But before we get into it, I wanted to tell you about this new thing that we're doing leading up to July 4th, which is we're trying to get 10,000 YouTube subscribers. And if we hit that number, Matt Vader74, the co-host of mine on the Salty Nerd podcast, has agreed to get a tattoo on one of his butt cheeks of the Salty Nerd logo. And he has also agreed to live stream it as he's getting the tattoo done. So we want to.
I heard him say that, which, by the way, for me is not a selling point. I was all about this plan until I heard about the promised live stream. And no offense to Matt Vader, but I'm going to have to do my best to miss that one.
We're not going to show his butt. We're going to show his face as he's getting the tattoo on his butt.
Fair. All right.
Yeah. Family friendly. I mean, come on. But he's going to be doing a lot of drinking, and Jude's going to be there supervising. And we're going to have the whole live stream set up at the tattoo parlor. Tremendous. And his wife is going to be there telling him not to do it and all that good stuff. So, it's kind of just a funny thing. And it was Matt Vader's idea. I think one night he just went in Discord and he's like, hey, if we can hit 10,000 YouTube subscribers, I'll do this. And everyone was like, oh, really? And so we're actually doing it. We're trying to make it a thing. So if we can hit 10,000 subs by July 4th, Matt Vader 74 will put up and not shut up. So if you guys have any friends that are fans of the podcast, or even if they're not fans of the podcast, we just need those subscribe numbers to go up and check it out. And we're also putting out a lot of really fun content right now. Our next episode coming out tomorrow, actually, is about failed female crossovers, Chris. And I don't know if you've seen these movies, but the first movie we're talking about is the Cindy Crawford vehicle Fair Game with the mid-range William Baldwin.
I remember it.
Yeah. Then we're talking about Showgirls with Jesse Spano from Saved by the Bell.
Yes. Okay.
And then the final movie is Barbed Wire, starring Pamela Anderson.
Sure. A classic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And we have a lot of fun talking about those movies. So
presented in ascending order of quality.
Exactly. But they were all bombs, and they were all Razzie Award nominees and winners. So it was a fun discussion. It was a fun week. We saw so many naked ladies that we got bored watching them. It was weird. All right. So
you do live in Vegas, so I mean
that's true, but I don't get out much. I don't leave the house all that much.
Yeah, nobody does these days, it seems.
That's true. That's true. You know what? I have not caught the disease that shall not be named. I am vaccinated, but both Jude and I have somehow evaded, contracting this disease, which I'm cool with. I don't know if I can get it.
Don't jinx it.
Yeah, I know, right? All right, so let's talk about our first news topic here, which is Peacemaker versus Boba Fett. Now, I actually found this kind of interesting because Business Insider came out with a piece about the new HBO Max show Peacemaker, and we're actually reviewing it on the podcast. Mm-hmm. And it said that Peacemaker has become the most popular show on streaming according to Parrot Analytics. And according to Parrot Analytics data, it says that it's almost 70 times more in demand than the average streaming series. 70 times. So that's pretty big. It has surpassed Netflix's hit fantasy series The Witcher and Disney Plus's Star Wars Book of Boba Fett in terms of like demand. So like, Parrot Analytics is looking at all the data that they're collecting from all these different streaming services. They're like, wow, the viewership of Peacemaker, especially like when an episode is released, is way higher than any of these other shows. So HBO Max also reached like record subscriber numbers last year. They have nearly 74 million worldwide users with an average user value of about $11 a person. And they took in $3.5 billion in subscription revenue in the last quarter of 2021, which was the biggest growth of any AT&T property. I'm just going to pop this up here. So this is the article that kind of details all this stuff. And as you can see, they have this graph here, which shows that HBO Max's growth has been beating out Netflix and Disney Plus, mostly due to the strength of their original series. So have you been watching the Book of Boba Fett at all?
I have. Yep. I've been keeping up with both series.
So what are your thoughts on the two shows?
Well, look, if you're going to ask me which one am I enjoying more, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I think. I don't know. That means different things, very different things to different people these days. But I enjoy many things about Star Wars quite a bit. But I like Peacemaker better. It's just in terms of a well-made series, it's I think head and shoulders above as a self-contained product. And I don't dislike the Book of Boba Fett. I know that's been pretty divisive as far as fan reactions to it. I think it's pretty good. Somewhere between just okay and pretty good, which by Disney Star Wars standards, I think is vaulting over the bar pretty well. But man, Matt, going back to the success of HBO Max, I really enjoyed the Suicide Squad. And I know you did too. And I did not expect to either. I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. I like what James Gunn did with Guardians of the Galaxy a lot. If he brings that sensibility to this, maybe it'll be okay. And I got through it. And the next day I watched it again because I just enjoyed it so much. It was such a delightful surprise. And so when I saw that they were going to do a Peacemaker series, I was in from the moment they ran the teaser trailers months ago. And so far, I have not been disappointed. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, if you had told me that a DC show starring a D-list comic book character would beat out a Star Wars TV show, I'd have said you were crazy. At least if you had told me this like 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like Star Wars has damaged its brand so much.
Mm-hmm.
Through like the movies, but also through like the corporate culture and how they treat their fans and some of their stars and stuff like that, that people like are almost actively rooting for it to fail. And though I like the 2 seasons of Mandalorian, I've been finding the Book of Boba Fett to be a wildly uneven show.
Yeah.
Like the character's not as cool as he used to be. They kind of like use the strange narrative structure where they were flashbacking to his time outside of the Sarlacc pit in the wilds at Tatooine with the Sand People, which just wasn't all that interesting of a story. At least I didn't think so. And all the crime lord stuff was, to me, like the interesting part of that show, because the criminal underworld in Star Wars is actually like really fascinating, but they never really focused enough on it for my taste. And then in this previous episode, they literally stopped the story to give us the premiere of The Mandalorian season 3.
Right.
Like Boba Fett didn't show up at all in this episode.
And a lot of people feel it was the best episode of the 5 released so far, and I'm pretty sure I agree with them. Yeah,
because it had nothing to do with Boba Fett. But the surprising thing to me was, so like when Peacemaker came out, I had really enjoyed James Gunn's take on the Suicide Squad, which surprised me because I was not a fan of the first one, the David Ayers one.
Yeah, it was a mess.
Yeah, it was pretty awful. But James Gunn has this uncanny knack of taking like these ridiculous characters from DC Comics, the most obscure characters you can think of, and turning them into fascinating, multi-faceted, interesting characters. Even if they're on screen for like a few seconds and get killed, you're like, oh yeah, I like that guy. Um, I actually listed The Suicide Squad as one of the best movies of 2021, in my opinion.
Sure.
So I was, when I heard that Peacemaker was coming out, I was like, okay, I'm interested in checking this out. And it was kind of funny because James Gunn actually came up with the idea while he was like locked down for COVID. And he just called up the people at HBO and was like, hey, I got this idea to do this. Is that cool? And they're just like, yeah. So like he wrote every episode in the series. It's like an 8-hour movie. He directed the first 3 episodes. And I was surprised, like when I sat down and watched the first 3 episodes, at how funny and engaging that show was. And it's like your typical like James Gunn style of humor, where he'll take a mundane thing and blow it up. Like their arguments over like, do you pronounce it Berenstein Bears or Berenstein Bears? And there's like a whole like 2-minute scene of them arguing like how do you pronounce it? So like I really enjoyed that aspect to it. But apparently the show is doing so well that a season 2 is almost guaranteed.
Yep.
And I'm like, wow, like I wonder where they will go with the season 2, and if James Gunn will write every episode again. I mean, like I certainly hope so. And John Cena's killing it in this show, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know from listening to your guys' reviews, Vader, who's a big pro wrestling fan, talks about what a divergence from the John Cena wrestling character this performance is. And to me, that's probably a really good move for him career-wise, to show off that range, to be able to play this like hyper masculine character who's also got this really tortured side to him because of his past and how he was brought up, and to fit all of that into this quirky comedic vehicle. Like, yeah, he's done a really, really impressive job of keeping all that held together in a way that's kept me engaged, and my wife too, to talk about why I think one of the reasons HBO Max is doing so well. Look, I love HBO Max. I think HBO's been the best producer of television consistently for 20 years. And so just the back catalog of all its shows, that's a great selling point to me. And then, they've added the Warner film catalog. Access to all of that is great. My daughter, a little bit too old for Sesame Street by the time HBO acquired it, but I know we were watching that with her when she was a kid. So there's stuff for people with young kids on there. And then, you have shows like this that my wife and I are both watching Book of Boba Fett together and watching Peacemaker. And I can tell with Boba Fett, she's kind of dragged into it and fallen asleep by the end of the episode. And Peacemaker, she's excited to watch the next one and ready for it to come out. I'm sure John Cena not wearing too much clothing in a lot of the scenes contributes to that. But, again, broad audience appeal. That's how you make the green.
Yeah, well, what's funny is my fiance Jude, she's not a Star Wars fan. She never has been. So she refuses to watch Book of Boba Fett with me. But she'll watch the crap out of Peacemaker.
Yeah,
and it's not because
something for everybody.
It's not because she thinks John Cena is attractive or anything like that. It's because she thinks the show is genuinely funny and she enjoys watching it. Which is also kind of funny because she's not really huge on comic book movies either. It's interesting though, because Disney has probably an even bigger library than Warner does in terms of like, movies and stuff that they can showcase on their streaming channel. But HBO Max has had such growth over the course of the past year, and they were kind of widely criticized for their strategy of doing like the same day movie releases on their streaming service as they did in the theaters for all of 2021, where they took like their big movie releases and just popped them out on HBO Max. But I personally love that because like I was like, I'm going to sit here with my big ass expensive TV in the comfort of my own home and watch these things. Like I wouldn't have gone and seen The Matrix 4 in the theater, I don't think, but I sat down and watched it at home because it was part of my package. Same thing for like Mortal Kombat and a bunch of other like HBO releases over the course of the last year. And I actually think that that strategy was brilliant for them because it got people signing up for that stuff because they wanted to see these things without having to go to the theater.
Yeah, it's a tremendous value add that does feel like it's proactively responding to changes in consumer preferences. Because to your point, and Matrix 4 is a great example. At least half a dozen movies I have watched first run films on HBO Max that there is a 0% chance I would have paid to go see in a movie theater, whether there was a receding global pandemic or not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's been a big boon to them as well. Just to go back to the Peacemaker Suicide Squad bit too, I also feel like throughout its cinematic run, the DCEU has had this kind of Simpsons did it problem with Marvel, where it always felt like Marvel beat them to the punch, and then they were stuck trying to create the dollar store version of what we'd already seen from Marvel. And I love the way both Suicide Squad and Peacemaker are totally forging their own path, which is what I thought was a smart way for DC to play it, to just kind of lean into the fact that they are home to a lot of these exceptionally strange, idiosyncratic characters and stories. And if you can just hit the proper balance that Marvel did in its own way with its characters, of just like a real, like a twinge of self-awareness, but still ultimately kind of taking itself seriously in an internally consistent way, you can get something that's really fun and charming. And I think I don't know if that's just unique to a James Gunn thing or whether or not they can replicate that and extend it out into the non-Batman DC universe. But on those two properties, I thought it's worked really well.
I mean, I honestly think they should bring James Gunn in to just oversee the entire DCEU because what he's been doing with Peacemaker, like he made Batmite canon.
Yes.
Like in the last episode, they talk about Batmite and you're like, did they just bring Batmite into the DCEU, And if you look at the Suicide Squad and how he dealt with all these like D-list and Z-list characters that exist in DC Comics and made them interesting and fast, like what was Nathan Fillion's the one with the detachable arms, I mean, like there was so much cool stuff that he did with those characters because they were ridiculous, and I just think that like if they let him kind of like plan stuff out with the big guns, fans would flock back to it in droves because I think he could kind of walk that fine line between like the Snyder, what do you call it, pretentiousness. Of like like the gods among men type superheroes, and the mundane, stupid, silly, ridiculous stuff, and balance them out perfectly. Like I would love to see a James Gunn directed Batman. In fact, I don't know if you ever saw Brightburn, but Brightburn is like a Superman origin story if Superman became evil. And it's a great play on like the Superman origin story, and it was really good, and it was written and produced by James Gunn. So definitely recommend checking that out. But yeah, I would love to see James Gunn, kind of take over the DCEU. In fact, I think they're doing something similar with Dune, where Denis Villeneuve is producing a show about the Bene Gesserit, on HBO Max. So like they're gonna do that. But that was one movie I did go see in the theaters was Dune. But then I came home and watched it on HBO Max anyway. All right. So speaking of streaming services, let's talk about Peacock. So I don't know if you guys heard about this, but Comcast recently had a earnings call where they came on board and told their investors about all the money that they lost in 2021. And, to contrast it with HBO's amazing growth, where they're making like, was it like $1 billion a month, essentially? Peacock actually lost money. And Peacock hit 25.5 million monthly active subscriber counts. And only 9 million of those are paid subscribers. 7 million of those are via bundles. And they're only about $1 less in value than the HBO Max ones. The HBO Max subscribers were worth about $11 on average each. and Peacock is about $10 on average per subscriber revenue. They generated $778 million in revenue in 2021, but they lost $1.7 billion. And they're not expected to break even until 2025. And Peacock's one of those weird things where like they spent a lot of money to kind of get it up and running because they were like, hey, I guess we need a streaming service since everyone's doing streaming.
Right.
And they spent a ton of money on some like originals that nobody really cared about.
Yeah.
And so like I think a lot of that loss is basically not only like the infrastructure rollout of the platform, but a lot of these original series that they created that didn't really go anywhere. So do you have Peacock? Is that something that you subscribe to?
I sort of. I am almost positive we are not among the paying subscribers. We're not one of the we're not one of the 9 million or however many it is. Look, both Peacock and CBS All Access, when it was still around, it's now Paramount Plus. They both sort of felt like a solution in search of a problem to me. Like you said, it kind of felt like someone went into a corporate board meeting and said, "Oh, the money's in streaming services now. Why don't we get one of these streaming services? You make one of those and you just take it straight to the bank." And
it's a license to print money, I tell you.
Yeah, precisely. And again, there's only so much time and so much bandwidth for consuming entertainment media, especially when we're not forced to be locked in our houses 24/7 anymore, right? And there are already so many other players in the market with a clearly defined and substantial value proposition and clearly understood reason to exist, that I think it feels like, I don't want to say it's too late necessarily, because I mean these are major players with tremendous budgets they can put behind this, and as that article states, they can continue to lose money on this thing for multiple years and survive. But look, when I go through the way I consume entertainment, the only path forward I see for Peacock is if they can make it a live sports destination for me, because otherwise I don't know what they're going to offer to me as a consumer who likes a lot of different kind of programming that's going to get me off my steady diet of ESPN, Big Ten Network, and then Disney Plus, HBO Max, and Netflix.
You mean reruns of The Office aren't enough to get you to subscribe?
They're not.
Well, yeah, I actually watched a couple of Peacock's original series. They did one on the sci-fi book Brave New World, starring Aaron Allwright, the guy who was the young Han Solo.
Yeah,
Alan Reich, yeah.
Yep.
That was okay. And then I watched the Dan Brown Lost Symbol one, and that was boring as heck. So I haven't been too. I think they also did a Saved by the Bell revival that I didn't watch. If they were smart, they would have taken Yellowstone and made it like an exclusive to Peacock or something like that, because that show's hugely popular. But real quick, just going to the chat here. 52 movies a year says HBO has more multi-genre brand than Disney does.
Yeah.
It's very true. David Nakasi, I'm probably mispronouncing that name. Sorry, David. Disney has a problem with anything that approaches an R rating. Yeah, in fact, they're going to add a new channel to Disney Plus called Star, where they have the more adult stuff on there. So
I don't understand, Matt. Maybe you could explain this to me, because I know a limited amount about the intricacies of the behind-the-scenes business stuff. They own Hulu, do they not?
They have a stake in Hulu.
Okay, all right. So that, because it always, to me, I thought, why don't they just combine that into one? Like, even if it's a more expensive bundle deal to get them both.
Well, I think
just have like some sort of lock mechanism that's going to keep your little kids from getting into Hulu or whatever.
I knew Hulu. There were like 3 studios involved in it. One was Disney, one was, I believe, Warner Brothers, and the other one was Fox. Okay. And when Disney acquired Fox, they got a majority share in Hulu.
Right.
But they don't own it outright. I think they're just like a majority shareholder of it. but it's part of their bundle. I could be wrong. They might own it outright. Don't quote me on that, but I don't think they do. But I think that having everything under one umbrella is probably a smarter play. And plus, Hulu having different stuff than Disney Plus, it's a way to multiply your subscriber base. So combining them, I don't think would be a smart thing to do personally. But I mean, who knows? Hulu's out there doing their originals. They got like a lot of interesting programming on there that you can't find on any other streaming services. Zach says Disney has developed a problem with anything resembling a good story. That comes from the top down, and it's weird because Alan Horn, the guy who was in charge of their movie studio, he usually had pretty good instincts, and he made some really good decisions on certain movies to make. But in terms of like their big franchises, they've just been dropping the ball left and right, and I really do think it has to do with like the people at the top just not understanding the properties. And then 52 movies a year says, yep, I believe great shows can be made with a PG rating, but not every story is completely told in a PG environment. And just want to give a shout out to Kaylee. Hi, Kaylee. Thanks for coming to the news stream, is what I'm calling it. All right. So that was a streaming service that compared to HBO Max, but we got more HBO Max news when it comes to James Gunn. So it turns out James Gunn is actually developing a second HBO Max TV show. And I found this very interesting because basically Peacemaker is definitely going to get a season 2 just based off of like how popular the show is. And HBO is probably looking at the numbers, and James Gunn himself even said like it looks like it's almost a done deal. And Guardians of the Galaxy 3, James Gunn has confirmed that's going to be the last of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. So like he's going to do like a trilogy, and then he's going to bail. And it's kind of funny because like him getting fired from Guardians of the Galaxy to begin with is what created the opportunity for him to jump over to DC and do the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker to begin with. But apparently he's doing another TV show that's just in the embryonic stages. Like HBO hasn't greenlit anything, but more than likely they probably are. But they're giving him carte blanche to basically just do whatever he wants. And so he's like, I want to do another show that's related to Suicide Squad. And so a lot of people are thinking that he's going to take another character from the Suicide Squad movie he made and spin them off into their own series. And it could be Ratcatcher 2. I think it'd be brilliant if he somehow figured out a way to bring Polka Dot Man back.
Please.
I would love a Polka Dot Man series.
Yes.
It could be something that is like a prequel leading up to like, the Michael Rooker character who died at the beginning of the Suicide Squad, to show how he wound up in prison. There's all types of stuff that he could do, but a lot of people are kind of speculating like maybe it's even more outside the box, where he's taking something that is kind of like how the White Dragon, Peacemaker's white supremacist father, he was a kind of tangential character in the comics that had some run-ins with the Suicide Squad occasionally, and he plucked that character out of obscurity and just like put him like in the forefront. So what would you like to see from a James Gunn TV show for the DC Comics?
Yeah, man. A team-up show with Ratcatcher 2 and Polka Dot Man, if I had to come up with another Suicide Squad spinoff. But I am now hung up on and totally intrigued by your notion that he could kind of use this as Warner's gateway drug to allowing him to sort of evolve into the Kevin Feige of the DC universe, because I want to see something different from DC from what we've already gotten from Marvel. And to me, again, that's leaning into the quirkiness inherent to that property. Like, give me an updated, modernized, something that works for a 2020 audience version of the Super Friends DC universe. Like, we have gotten 2 or 3 like good spins on the Tim Burton Dark Knight Returns version of brooding, dark, dimly lit like taken to its extreme in the Zack Snyderverse DC. I want to see something more colorful and quirky and with a little bit of self-aware ironic humor to it, but some heart as well. That chemistry that he made the Suicide Squad totally fueled on. If he can use these smaller shows as a lab to work that formula out and then extend it to a place where we could see Superman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and the Flash and even Batman and Robin coming into that paradigm, I would love to see it take that direction, because I would feel like that's something we haven't gotten before.
Yeah, and one of the things that he did mention is that whatever show he is working on right now, it's going to be slightly more serious than Peacemaker. He's like, it's not going to be as much of a comedy as Peacemaker is, because Peacemaker just lends itself to being a comedy. I mean,
and it works so well as that.
And Rick Flag said it best in the Suicide Squad, where he's like, Peacemaker, what a joke. And it's like, yeah, Peacemaker is a joke, but that's the joke. It's like,
right.
He doesn't have any superpowers. He's just kind of like this dim-witted guy who's like good at fighting and stuff like that. And the whole Dove of Peace thing, I love that they're like fleshing out like this little thing. In fact, the whole conversation they had about Batman's Rogues Gallery in the most recent episode, brilliant. He's like, how many people has Batman killed by not killing these stupid supervillains? It's like, yeah, he's got a point.
And it has such a motley but such a likable ensemble cast. Mm-hmm. I can't think of any supporting player on that show that I'm not rooting for. I mean, I even have a certain attraction to Robert Patrick, the way he is playing just such a despicable villain.
He's
like
great.
He's so good at it. You're like, oh man, what a great villain. And the ancillary characters are a lot of fun. The members of the team they all fit together so
Hbo Master.
Well. Yeah, it's great. He's really hit a home run.
I'm kind of hoping they bring back the weed smoking janitor from the hospital at some point.
Well, he's in the dance sequence. He's got to come back at some point, right?
He is. And Eagly, not since Grogu have I seen people freak out about a non-human character in the show.
Yes. Yeah, really well done. I'm enjoying it a lot.
Yeah, Eagly hugs are the best hugs. All right, chat. Any of you want to say anything about James Gunn's show before we move on to our next topic? Let me know. But I'm really hoping that the next show goes very obscure, like just takes a character that nobody cares about, nobody even remembers, and frickin' flips it on its head. I heard someone joke that they want like Stilt Man, but he's Marvel. But it'd be funny to see something like that happen. All right. So in other news, Squid Games has been renewed for a season 2 officially. So Variety is reporting that season 2 has officially been greenlit by Netflix, and Squid Games was the #1 most viewed TV series on Netflix in 2021. 1.65 billion hours of the show has been streamed, and Netflix only paid $21.4 million for that show. Now, to give some context to that, they paid $24 million for the last Dave Chappelle special, which was only like 90 minutes long, I think. And also created a huge controversy that Netflix is still kind of like weathering, I guess. But the showrunner for the original season of Squid Games is coming back, as is lead actor Lee Jung-jae, who will return as Song Ji-hun, the main character of that show, who we saw at the end of the previous season, kind of gearing up to go to battle with whoever's behind the Squid Games. So, Chris, did you watch the first season of Squid Games?
I did. I did not watch it when everybody else did. This is terrible. I'm not proud of this, but I do have this contrarian streak in me that when something gets extraordinarily popular, if everyone is telling me to watch it, I just kind of act like a jerk and don't watch it to spite them or spite the world, I guess. I don't know. So I waited a few months before I actually sat down and watched it, the fervor had mostly died down. I did enjoy it. I mean, I can understand why people were so riveted by it. It was really enjoyable. Look, if I'm being honest, I think I'm sort of ambivalent about a second season for it. I'm a big believer in dying a hero or living long enough to see yourself become the villain. I think sometimes we just go to the well too often. Going back to HBO Max, maybe my favorite piece of television of the last 25 years, if not ever, is the first season of True Detective. And what I love about it is it's a self-contained story, and we are never going to see anything more about those characters ever again. What you got was wonderful, and that was it. You enjoy it, you appreciate it, you treasure it, you go back to it, you move on. I've never read any of those sequel Watchmen comics. I didn't watch the Watchmen series on HBO. The original work, to me, self-contained, perfect, leave it alone. I kind of felt like Stranger Things should have ended after one season, and I guess I feel the same way about Squid Game. But when you're talking about that kind of money, I understand there's a 0% chance that there's not going to be a sequel. I'll probably watch it. It will probably be fine. I don't know that it's going to be able to recapture the fervor that the first one generated, but it'll bring subscribers in, no question.
Well, one of the interesting things about Squid Game is that it's very similar to John Wick in the sense that they created this world that these crazy things happen in. And any good science fiction and fantasy show does the same thing, where they do some world building that fans want to revisit. And it's not so much the story that's being told, it's the world that people get to experience. And I think that's one of the reasons why it hits such a cultural nerve. You know, everyone was at home, everyone was bored, they like watched through everything. And then here's this obscure South Korean TV show that is messed up in the best way possible. And everyone's just like, what the heck is this? And after you get past the second episode, like it just is nonstop.
You're totally sucked in. Yep.
Oh yeah. Gut punch after gut punch after gut punch. And it felt like they set up so many questions that audiences are like, I want to find out the answer to that, you know? So like, it was very interesting storytelling. And I also think that a lot of people are so disappointed with what American storytellers are coming out with in terms of like Hollywood.
Yeah, no question.
Like we were talking about Book of Boba Fett at the beginning of the show and how uneven that series is. And then you compare it to something like Squid Games, which every episode like would surprise you in some way, shape, or form. And it was good, and you cared about the characters, and you cared about the stakes, and you cared about the outcome. And it's like, how is this obscure South Korean show killing it on every level of storytelling, and the people in Hollywood whose job it is to do stuff like this can't seem to figure it out?
Well, and I think they had a lot of things going for it that worked to hook the audience beyond everything you already listed. You know, look, really compelling, emotional performances from the cast, a fascinating aesthetic. Just the look of the show drew you in because it was so different and so cool. I also think, and this again, I think is maybe a little bit of a lightning in a bottle aspect, probably a huge portion of the audience, and not just here in the States, was looking for some kind of outlet for this sense they have that we're all sort of sinking into this like dystopian existence, and something that allowed us to engage with those feelings that we have that we probably haven't been able to totally port over from our lizard brain to our rational mind. That was attractive to us on some kind of a subcognitive level, I think, which is, again, like why I understand the idea of the appeal of going back to that world. But again, sometimes I think filling in what's left outside the edges of the lens is not always the best way to go. Book of Boba Fett's a great example, right? Like if you would have gone to me and said like, hey, you know, in the 1980s, like, wouldn't you love to hear more of the story of Boba Fett told? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe I like 1,000 different versions of it because there are 1,000 different imaginative flights of fancy in the brains of Star Wars fans about what Boba Fett is. And the minute you collapse it down to he's a clone of Jango Fett, then that's all you get.
The
right?
minute you take the
So
helmet off.
yeah. So I mean, again, the more you strip that world of its mystique, maybe the less alluring it becomes. But I again, I'm not trying to be a party pooper here or anything. I'm ambivalent. I'm not negative. Just not. I'm not jumping out of my seat in eager anticipation of another season of
Well,
Squid.
I do feel like the guy behind Squid Games has a plan for future seasons, which is a big thing because most of Hollywood just kind of goes forward without a plan. They're like, "Oh, it's a hit. Let's make more of it."
Yeah.
Um, and with Netflix kind of has this weird uncanny ability to time stuff. Like I remember when Making a Murderer, the first season came out over Christmas time, like years ago, and my entire family were just riveted to that show. And then Tiger King came out at the start of the pandemic, and everyone watched Tiger King because everyone was like, "Well, we're locked in our houses. What's on here? Oh, this crazy, like bizarre, like tiger show. Like let's check it out." It became a
Now that
cultural
is one
phenomenon.
show I watched when everybody told me to watch it. I watched Tiger King with the rest of America.
Yeah. Did you watch the second season?
I did.
What'd you think?
It was fine. It was, it was
Not
fun.
enough
It was
Joe
entertaining.
Exotic. Joe Exotic carried the first season, man.
Yeah, it's probably tough. It's probably tough to have a lot of Joe Exotic when he's in prison, right?
Yeah.
But it was fine.
Yeah, but having like a foreign language TV show become such a cultural phenomenon here in the States, like that's very rare.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with. I think Netflix even said that it generated something like over $1 billion in impact value for the streamer. And Netflix has a weird way of kind of judging TV shows and movies that they release because they don't sell anything. It's like
right.
They're not putting out DVDs and box sets and stuff.
It's like that. South Park. This made us $3 billion theoretical dollars.
Yeah, actually, if we have time at the end of this, I'm kind of gonna try to break down how Netflix kind of determines what's valuable and what isn't. But moving on from Squid Games, let's talk a little bit about Star Trek. So, as you know, the trailer for season 2 of Picard kind of came out, but there was a recent interview with Patrick Stewart and the showrunner Akiva Goldsman, who wrote Batman and Robin, the movie, and is also an Oscar winner. So there's that. But there was an interview with both of them.
What a remarkable juxtaposition.
I know, right? Akiva Goldsman, don't get me started. Okay. But they basically came out and said for a fact that there are only going to be 3 seasons of Star Trek Picard.
Right.
The 3rd season is going to be the final one. There was never a plan to go past 3. They always planned for Patrick Stewart to be 3 and done. So basically a trilogy. Patrick Stewart plans to retire the character at the end of the 3rd season. So basically we're not going to see Picard again ever after the season 3 of Picard. And they started shooting it back to back with season 2. So as they started going with season 2, season 3 picked up, and they were shooting some stuff concurrently with season 2 to try to get this done. And I think a lot of that comes down to Patrick Stewart not being a spring chicken. They're like, we better get this done before he moves on to that great big stage in the sky. But are you a Star Trek fan? Did you watch Star Trek?
Yeah, sure.
What did you think of season 1 of Picard?
I was underwhelmed by it. I can't say that I enjoyed it a whole heck of a lot. I didn't hate it the way some folks did, but I definitely understand why the people who hated it did. Look, there's a lot of not complimentary things I could say about it. It's been a while. I'm trying to think back to it now. I was kind of reviewing in my head what I thought about the series when you told me we were going to talk about it tonight. Look, one of the first things that really bothered me about it is that what got me into Star Trek and the reason why I enjoyed it was my dad was a fan of the original series. And so I can very clearly remember sitting down and watching Encounter at Farpoint when it aired for the first time with my dad. And I had watched reruns of the original series with him going into it. So I kind of knew the basic idea. And I thought, okay, hey, look, this is going to be a new enterprise and a new crew. I didn't have the same emotional attachment to people who had grown up with it. So I was very quick to adopt the Next Generation as my show and my crew. And I was young enough to not appreciate how terrible the storytelling was in the first season. So it was really, I was in the sweet spot. And for 7 seasons, my family and I got together and watched that show every week. And one of the things that I really didn't like, and my wife said the same thing because she watched The Next Generation with her dad, is that our daughter was, I think, about 6 or 7 years old when Picard came on. And it was not the kind of show we felt comfortable sitting down and watching with a little kid. It didn't feel like
it was not family friendly.
A family show. No, not at all. And look, there were other things I didn't like. First of all, like, all the self-congratulatory interviews I saw in the run-up to it about like the important, quote unquote, important trademark messaging. I'm like, guys, look, but by the time the show premiered, like, doing Trump and Brexit allegories is not exactly speaking truth to power. Okay. Like, I've heard this same lesson told 100 times, 50 different ways. You're not doing anything brilliant or edgy or at this point even necessary. Everyone who has an opinion about this shit already has it, and you're not doing anything to change it. And for you to come around and say doing Brexit analogies in 2019 or whatever it was is comparable to the same kind of genuinely edgy messaging that they were doing on a consistent basis in the 1960s Star Trek is just laughable. It's revisionist history. So I had a problem with that. I also had a difficult time with the fact that Star Trek has always been an aspirational franchise. It's always been a source of hope. And look, again, bleak times and a politically divisive climate in the country and the world is not something that is unique to the 2020s. Again, going back to when the franchise originated, you don't think times were tough and people were at each other's throat in this country and around the world in the 1960s? And that's what made people care about this franchise for 50 years. It was the fact that in a time of bleakness, when everybody had that same sort of dystopian lizard brain fear in them, whether it was because of racial tensions or the war in Vietnam or the fear of nuclear annihilation, that Star Trek came along and said, hey, no, this is a reason to be hopeful. And the show always cast Earth and always cast humanity as the aspirational good guys. And to me, Star Trek Picard, I think largely because of the vanity play of allowing Patrick Stewart to have, like, a playground to exercise his own personal political beliefs, inadvertently was retrograde with a lot of that stuff. And so, again, I just kind of took umbrage at that as a longtime fan. And I just didn't think it was done particularly well. I thought as the season went on, it got more and more over the top. Again, going back to leave the Watchmen alone, leave a lot of these other franchises alone. I wish they would have stopped at the best of both worlds with the Borg. And I just felt, just like Boba Fett, the more and more backstory we got on the Borg, whether in the movies or Voyager or even further on in the Next Generation, the less compelling they became as villains. And so the fact that we're just going to keep flogging the corpse of the horse that is the Borg as a narrative device, they did it in this season, and apparently it's just going to keep happening again and again till the end of Picard. Like, sometimes less is more. And, look, I'm letting out a lot of pent-up Star Trek Picard aggression, Matt. There are some nice things I could say about it, but I have a feeling probably your audience doesn't want to hear any of those things.
Are you kidding? I could listen to another hour of that rant. But like you, Picard was my captain. He's the guy I grew up with. Next Generation was my Star Trek show. And I was so hopeful for that series. Like, me and Matt Vader both, when we start watching it, the first episode, we were like, well, hopefully it gets better. Second episode, hopefully it gets better. We kind of likened it to being in an abusive relationship where, like, it's like, no, He loves me. I just gotta hang in there. Maybe he'll change. It's like, no, he's gonna come in and slap you around.
The Federation we saw from the beginning of the original series to the end of Enterprise would not have Space Fox News doing a gotcha interview with Captain Picard, right? Like that was an absurd, world-breaking narrative device that showed up in the first episode. And I was just like, what purpose is this serving? Like, it's not only that it doesn't make any coherent sense with the fictional world we've been allowed to inhabit for decades. Going back to my point about you're not speaking truth to power. What are you trying to tell me? That headline, a lot of people don't like Fox News. Cable news is shitty. What a daring stance to take with allegorical science fiction in 2019, guys. Man, you're just obliterating boundaries here with this daring take. It's so frustrating. And the fact that they would do it with this iconic character. Listen, you and I have talked over the years about how we're both pretty sure George Lucas didn't understand what made Star Wars good. I think along in that same vein, I have come to appreciate the fact that actors who portray iconic characters tend to lose sight, or if they ever had it to begin with, why those characters are so beloved in the first place. So it's for writers to write and actors to act, and you have to be extraordinarily careful when you allow the performer to become larger than the role or the property and give them an outsized say in what happens in the storytelling. And I got very strongly the impression that the way they enticed Patrick Stewart to come back and inhabit Captain Picard again was by allowing him free reign to influence the story. And I think he did it in ways that compromised what made the character of Picard meaningful to people who cared about him in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, Akiva Goldsman flat out said that they had to give Patrick Stewart some amount of creative control in order to get him to agree to come back.
Harrison, if you come back and do this, we'll kill off Han Solo.
Well, it's like, Harrison, please come back. He's like, can you kill off Han Solo? It's like, yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Yeah. But what's kind of funny is, like, as a storyteller, the smart thing to do is always to try to make your show evergreen, try to make your movie timeless,
Yeah.
Because when people watch it 10, 20 years from after you make it, they're not going to know what the context was that you were trying to talk about. And I think that's one of the interesting things about all the entertainment that was made during the Trump era, where, like, they're all very anti-Trump and all this stuff that they weave those messages into their entertainment shows. And then, like, we're going to be watching those things for 8-10 years later and just being like, oh, this is so outdated. And
again, you put an Asian guy and a Russian guy and a black woman on the bridge of the Enterprise and set it in the 23rd century in 1960s television because you couldn't tackle those topics head on in the media environment that existed with 3 television networks, right? Well, nobody needed allegory to be told that a bunch of people think Trump is bad. So, like, it's not apples to apples. It's not even close.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of the stuff that came out of the 60s and 70s, where it was all about Vietnam War allegories. It's like nowadays you watch those movies and the message is just lost on you, or it's so ham-fisted that you're just like, give me a break. So I always think it's best practice for storytellers to kind of try to make their stuff timeless as opposed to timely. So that's just my thought on it. But I'm kind of glad that Picard's only going to be 3 and done, because judging on the first season and from what I've seen of the second season so far, it's not something I want to keep watching.
All right. So one final thought on that, because I'm thinking about now John Delancey's going to come back, and I love that character. I think so many people do. And I'm like, my God, are they going to ruin Q as well? Now, again, I hated all the Q appearances in the Deep Space Nine and Voyager. I think those series, I love Deep Space Nine. It's my favorite Star Trek. But in general, I think when the post Next Generation properties tried to engage with supporting characters or races from Next Generation, with the exception of the way they built out the Klingons and Ferengi in Deep Space Nine. They didn't do them any favors. I have just, look, the Disney Star Wars has taught me to put up very high castle walls in my head between the property I knew and love and the way that they're being reinterpreted in the modern media sphere. So don't let them mess with your memory of Q.
I just want to highlight this this comment from Danny the Dork Knight, one of our fill-in guys. Picard was like getting the girl you always wanted to be with when the show was announced, but by the end of it, she turned out to be the most toxic and worst thing to ever happen to you in your life. And Danny was actually on one of our Salty Nerd episodes very early on in our Salty Nerd careers, talking about Picard and the disappointment that it was. So we feel you, Danny. We definitely feel you. Like I said, abusive relationship. All right, so now let's talk about another TV show that we have a complicated relationship with, which is Space Force, Season 2, Netflix's comedy from Steve Carell. So the first season of Space Force came out in, I believe it was 2020. And it's coming back in February of this year. So like basically took 2 years off. And they're making a lot of changes to it. So they just released a trailer for the second season. And Chris, I don't know if you watched the first season. We actually did a season review of it on our show. But it was a very uneven show. Like it wasn't funny enough to be a comedy.
Yeah.
And they had like a lot of satirical elements in there. Again, it was kind of like very timely with like the Trump era and, them commissioning this new branch of the military and stuff like that. And it was just a weird show. Like it had elements to it that were good and had potential, but for the most part, it just kind of fell flat on its face. And I think everyone working on it knew that.
Yeah, I couldn't make it through this second episode.
Yeah,
I think maybe because I try to go into things without expectations, and I think I was just because of the cast and the way they set it up, I was expecting an Office style farcical comedy, and it wasn't that. And I didn't like it. It didn't make me laugh. I didn't care about the characters. And again, like it's so hard to lampoon Trump because the Matt and Trey said it best. How can you lampoon the reality that's so funny? Like it's almost impossible for the satire to be funny than the thing it's parodying. And so I think it suffered from that too. So I just never got through it.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is that the showrunner and Steve Carell didn't want to redo The Office. Like they came into it, they're like, we want to make this more cinematic. We want to make it like a little bit more highbrow. And after the first season, they realized that style was killing them because to do cinematic shooting, you would have to take the time to like switch the cameras around, adjust the lighting and stuff like that. And by that time, like the interaction between the actors kind of got stale.
Yeah.
And so they were relying very much on scripted material for the laughs. And when you have a cast like this, a lot of the humor comes from like the actors just riffing off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so this season, they brought in a new co-showrunner named Norm Hiscock, who is the showrunner for Parks and Recreation. And he basically came in to kind of like make things funnier. And they switched up their style a little bit to kind of allow the actors to improv more and play off of each other. So this season is not going to be as cinematic and strictly scripted as previous seasons were, or the previous season was. And the big storyline, from what I gather, is that basically there's a new administration, and they're trying to figure out how to work under the new administration. And that's the premise of season 2. So what do you think of that? Do you think that this might be worth giving a second chance?
Well, I will tell you this. Had I not been made aware of this as a condition of my participation in this live stream, I never would have known about it. So unless I got pulled back in by the Salty Nerd review, my negative experience with the first series just would, again, there's only so much time. No way I ever would have gone back to a second season of this. now I may give it a chance, only because it makes a whole hell of a lot of sense what it says in the piece you've got up on the screen right now, talking about the cinematic style they were shooting for and the way that limited the chemistry between the cast and prevented them from being able to riff off each other in a more improvisational way. I felt, as I think back on it, that was definitely a shortcoming of it. And it was, in a way, why I felt like the show wasn't clicking with my expectations. So, if they can rework it, a lot of shows have a rough first season, since we were just talking about Star Trek The Next Generation, and they recover. So, yeah, maybe I'll give it another look now.
Also, this actor, Jimmy Yang, who was in, I believe it was Silicon Valley, he's a stand-up comedian. He's actually a pretty funny guy. He joined the writer's room in this season. So he had some direct input on like the scripts that were written.
Cool.
And they actually brought in a new director who basically did the entire season himself. Let's see if I can find the director here. Ken Kwapis. That's his name. Kwapis. So like he was the guy who directed the initial episodes of The Office. He was kind of like the guy who came and set the tone for that show.
Yeah.
And so like they brought him in to kind of revamp this show, which isn't unusual. Like like TV shows will often kind of bring in the original director who, sets the tone for like the premiere or what have you. But this guy, Kwapis, knows how to work with comedians and get them, pull comedy out of them. And he knows how to shoot comedy and stuff like that. And so he did the entire season. And it's becoming more and more regular for streaming originals to use one director throughout the entire season.
Yeah.
Especially if they were shooting during COVID, because just bringing in new people increases the chance of people catching the disease and passing it on to each other and then shutting down the whole production. So it's not surprising to hear that there's one director for this season. But to me, it sounds like they made some effort to course correct. And I'm interested to see how season 2 is going to be. Because season 1 did have some good bits to it, but just overall it was just kind of a meh show.
I'm curious. So as someone who did not make it through the series, how would you describe its strengths to me? If you were going to sell me on the good points of season 1 of Space Force, you would say they are...
The actors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cast was good. That's one of the reasons I was really hopeful for it.
Yeah, I mean, the situations that they were in, it was almost kind of Doctor Strangelove-y,
Right. Yeah, right.
Just kind of like over the top. And Steve Carell didn't play as much of a buffoon as he did in The Office, but he still had buffoonerish bits to him,
Right.
And I kind of wish that they had leaned into those more just to make it funnier. But like there's a great moment where, so the entire conflict of the first season is they're in a space race with China to create like a base on the moon, right? And so China keeps fucking with them, like they just keep doing this stuff where like they'll Space Force will shoot a satellite up there, and then China will send a guy in a spacesuit and he'll just like unplug some stuff on the satellite and then float away, and then the only way that they are able to fix it is to get a monkey that they shot out into space like 10 years ago to try and fix it, and hilarity ensues.
Sure.
They had a great bit about uniforms designed by Melania Trump, even though they never specifically said it was Melania.
Right.
But it was like more fashionable Space Force uniforms, and they were just ridiculous. That was pretty funny. But the biggest thing was the team leader who goes to the moon. She's a black woman, and she was going to be the first black woman on the moon. Okay. And so she was feeling the weight of that historic moment on her shoulders. And she came up with this line where, like, when she steps foot on the moon, she's going to say, "It's great to be back on the moon." Right. And that was going to be like her big moment, like kind of like one small step for man type thing.
Yeah.
And so, but she's so nervous that when she does it, the entire world's watching. She's like, "It's great to be black on the moon."
I saw where that was going. Yeah.
And then she was so mortified by it, and it just created like this whole like rigmarole at home, like about like racial identity and stuff. It was pretty funny.
Gotcha.
But like moments like that were very few.
I don't know. First of all, I think that'd be a great thing for the first black woman on the moon to say. But yeah.
but the character had so much integrity. Like she didn't want to be known as like
No, I understand. Sure.
that. Yeah. So like it was a very uneven show, but it had moments like that, and especially like John Malkovich, because he's a character in the show.
Yeah.
And Malkovich has such great comedic chops that he very rarely gets to like kind of showcase.
This is true.
Yeah, and so like seeing him on there was really good too. All right, so we've talked about Space Force. Let's talk about a more recent controversy, which is Neil Young versus Joe Rogan. So for those of you out there who might not be aware of this, Chris, can you tell people who Neil Young is? I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who have no idea who Neil Young is.
Do you think so? Really?
Yeah.
Well, okay, yeah. So yeah, Neil Young was one of the legends of rock going back to the 1960s, both as a member of multiple like chart-topping bands and as a solo artist. Yep, keep on rocking in the free world. You probably, if you're of a certain age that is around Kadish and myself, you probably remember him on stage performing that with Pearl Jam at I think the MTV Video Music Awards. Has been like a lot of rockers from the 60s, outspoken politically throughout his career. And again, without diving into the political morass of 2022 too deeply, whatever you thought you knew about the political spectrum, to the extent that still even exists in this country, you can have stayed pretty much the same in your beliefs over a set period of time and moved around on that spectrum a lot, or you may self-identify as being on one or the other side of the spectrum, and that's as a result caused you to totally trash beliefs you held previously and adopt the total opposite in order to stay in one part of the Venn diagram.
Yeah, I mean, one of the funny things about Neil Young is that he was like the quintessential 60s counterculture icon, right? Where he was like, screw authority,
you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Yeah. Screw capitalism, screw the man. I want to be a hippie. I want to smoke weed. I want to do my own thing. And, he was very anti-establishment. He was kind of like the poster boy for anti-establishment.
He was correctly, in my mind, an outspoken proponent of free speech during the George W. Bush years. Like you mentioned, for anybody who's been on the stream with us, and thanks to anybody who's spending any amount of their time with us, I really appreciate it. But if you've been on the stream since the beginning, you heard Matt and I talk about our days as film majors at Penn State. He stuck it out. I bitched out and finished as a journalism major. So I am like a radical First Amendment stan. And so I was very much in the Neil Young camp in terms of radical defense of our First Amendment rights, which I think are one of the, one of the very greatest things about this country. One of my professors at Penn State, journalism professors who spent a lot of time teaching over in China, said he would be asked by Chinese students what makes the West and what makes the United States specifically so great. And he said, my first answer is the First Amendment. And not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of it, Matt, which is encouraging the marketplace of ideas. That used to be Neil Young's thing back in the day.
Yep. And now with the disease that shall not be named, he kind of is actually very much in line with the establishment, where he's like for mask mandates, he's for vaccine mandates, he's very much like the COOF is a plague, and we all have to surrender our freedoms to the government in order to survive it. And so what he did was he called on Spotify to remove Joe Rogan's podcast for the spread of misinformation. And he was like, it's either me or Joe Rogan. You choose. And then he had his lawyers from Warner Records send Spotify a cease and desist. And they were like, you either take down Rogan stuff or you take down Neil Young stuff. And Spotify was like, let me check my stats real quick. So like they look at their stats and they're like, Joe Rogan's podcast gets 200 million downloads per month. Neil Young's music gets 6.6 million monthly listens on Spotify. Bye-bye, Neil Young. And so like they took down Neil Young's music, and Neil Young basically lost 60% of his worldwide streaming income due to this move. And Spotify said like, hey, if he ever wants to come back, more than happy to have him, but we're going to stick with Joe Rogan. And so Neil Young's gambit here kind of backfired. I think he thought he was more important than he really was. But
yeah, well, look, clearly, like Neil Young is a delusional buffoon for imagining that he had the political clout to bully Joe Rogan out of, off his platform, or bully Spotify into breaking a $100 million contract that they have with Rogan. But set aside the stupidity of an old man who imagines himself to be far more important and influential than he is. To me, it's just so offensive to my sensibilities that this guy who once fashioned himself a firebrand in the name of defying the establishment and encouraging free speech now sees the solution to a problem is that this lifelong leftists solution is I am going to turn to a multinational corporation and ask them to censor the largest independent media voice in the world because I don't like one thing that someone told me was on his platform. I guarantee you Neil Young probably never even listened to the episode that has everybody pissed off, which is like a fraction of all the content Joe Rogan's produced over the course of his show. And if you don't like it, then I'm going to, imagine that I can threaten you with taking my toys and go home. It's outrageous. And look, again, I don't care what you think about COVID mitigation measures or the vaccine or masks or any of that shit. I don't want to wade down into that quagmire. But the whole point that here was somebody who was vociferously pushing back against the post 9/11 security state mentality that was prevalent in society and in government during the 2000s, now doesn't understand that the same principles he was fighting for in that era still apply today. Like, this is not the American way to just find something you don't like and then appeal to some gigantic private corporation and say, can you please shut this off so that no one can have access to it? Like, that impulse to destroy and censor the marketplace of ideas, to me, is abhorrent. So, look, Neil Young is long past his day. He can sit and spin. I've no sympathy for him at all whatsoever.
Well, the crazy thing is like Neil Young's just a small part of this. Like, he's just the most recent thing where,
right.
Like, Joe Rogan has been targeted for cancellation by CNN. He's been targeted for cancellation by, basically the left for having the gall to question the narrative, right?
Yep.
And he's just fearless. Like, he's had people on who have been censored and banned everywhere else, and he's getting their message out. And, heaven forbid people should hear everything and then make up their own minds about it. But it's misinformation or disinformation because it goes against what, the people in charge personally believe. And it's very weird. CNN has done some really deceptive stuff to try to make Joe Rogan out to look like a crackpot, to look like, was it Alex Jones 2.0?
Yeah.
Right. Like when Joe Rogan got COVID, they actually made him look gray and pasty when they replayed his video announcing that he got COVID on CNN. They tried to make him look sicker than he was because, like, he was taking these alternative treatments that actually, helped him get over it really quick. And it was probably the Delta variant that he got. So
look, if you were suspicious of Patriot Act security state measures, of torture camps, of never-ending foreign wars, or any of the other excesses of American foreign policy during the 2000s, you have to be cognizant on some level of the dangers of allowing corporate-controlled traditional mass media to control the choke points of information. So you need to ask yourself whether or not that is a desirable alternative to Rogan's model, which is truly to open up the marketplace and allow for freer discourse, which is going to mean some craziness sneaks in there. There is going to be some static in the system. And you know what? I have listened to hours and hours and hours of Rogan's podcast. And I have not become a lunatic. I have not adopted belief in any crazy conspiracy theories. And if I'm being honest, my position on certain aspects of American domestic policy have probably moved towards the center or the left as a result of hearing them contextualized by his guests. And so I think that's another important point, that the loudest critics of Rogan they lose all credibility with people who listen to the show regularly, because their lack of familiarity with what he does is self-evident. And then you realize, oh, this person who is critiquing this thing doesn't really know anything about it or understand it, which then leads me to question what their motives are in trying to get me or anyone else to not even have the option of listening to what this guy's guests have to say, which most of the time is about stand-up comedy and like killing elk.
Well, also, one of the funny things about this is that Joe Rogan is not a right winger. You know, he voted for Obama. He was a Bernie supporter during the elections. You know, he's a guy who is big on, you know, recreational drugs like marijuana. But he's a threat to the establishment media, because if you think about how many people are in the United States, 350 million or so, yep. He gets 200 million downloads on his podcast every month. Like, that is crazy. That is over half of the population of the United States listens to his podcast. And because of that, you know, he's not someone who can be controlled by, you know, the media establishment, and they can't make him toe the narrative because he's a free thinker. He thinks for himself. He has on the people he wants to talk to. He talks about the stuff that interests him, and his listeners know him. And so, like, these attempts to gaslight people about, like, you know, him being like a alt-righter, or, you know, someone who's spreading disinformation or something like that, that just doesn't jive with the Joe Rogan that his listeners know.
Yeah, it doesn't hit.
And I think that was the same issue that they had with Rush Limbaugh, where, you know, Rush's audience kind of like knew him and trusted him. And so every time they came out to attack him, you know, his audience didn't shrink, because they're like, well, we know that's a lie. And you can see a lot of alt media people like Tim Pool and all these other guys who are doing their own thing and actually trying to be truthful in their reporting and show both sides and fair and balanced and stuff like that. And exposing the gaslighting, exposing the lies, and at least like giving people like an alternative to think about, you know, and letting them and respecting them enough to make up their own minds. Whereas like something like this, and every time it fails, and it seems to fail more spectacularly. Like, I don't think Neil Young genuinely thought that Spotify would choose him over Joe.
Right.
In a way, it was almost like a publicity stunt, I think. But at the same time, like, he's losing 60% of his streaming revenue. I don't know how much that was for him, but
I think Neil's going to be okay. I think he could lose 100% of his streaming revenue into perpetuity, and he would not be worrying about the price of gas and groceries, is my guess about Neil Young. And again, just to, you know, which is why, again, like, to be lectured to and condescended by these people is just so preposterous. One of the other things that I like about Rogan is, you know, he brings, this is has almost become a buzzword, but he brings an authenticity to what he does. And there's a humility and an honesty. He's self-critical. He admits and reflects on mistakes when he makes them. And one thing I have learned doing long form podcast, which as much as I like doing the TV show that I do, the longest segment we have in an hour long TV show is 8 minutes. when we get to sit down and really dig into a college football topic, whether we're interviewing a guy who played for Penn State, or we're talking about like the economics of the sport or the politics of it or whatever, we can go for 2 hours and we can really get into it. If your audience spends that amount of time with you, when they run into you out in public, it's not just that like they think they know you, they do know you. Because if you're behind the mic for that long and you're talking that consistently, you can't act that much. Your authentic self comes out. Now, my wife and I spend a lot of time trying to get my in-laws and my mom, get our parents off of cable news, 24/7 cable news. So I am exposed to very little, but still way more Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC than I would like in my life. And even that is enough for me to know that to call that junk food for your brain and your soul would be to insult junk food and its health benefits for your body. And the long form, interrogative, humble form of conversations that happen in front of hundreds of millions of people on Rogan's show is so antithetical to this totally useless, corrosive form of quote unquote news that is fed to us by the cable news networks. It's no shock that they want to try to destroy the guy, because he's not just a threat to their bottom line. He's an existential threat to their entire model of operation and their ability to use your term, gaslight their audience.
Yeah. Did you hear that after their airport contract ran out, CNN's ratings dropped 90%?
Yeah. Which is encouraging to me. Turn off cable news. It's garbage. Read a book. Meditate.
All right. Well, speaking of garbage, so we've gone through all the news stories that I wanted to cover on today's stream. But, you know, you've known me for a long time. You know that I like to get deep into the weeds on some of these wonky industry things. And so to everyone out there who's come to join us for the news bits, I want to thank you for coming. You're welcome to stay as I talk about some really geeky, how the sausage is made, Hollywood industry stuff. But if you want to leave, I won't blame you for it, because what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the show is about how Netflix measures the success of its original series and movies. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I get really annoyed when I see other YouTubers and Twitter users and stuff like that talk about ratings for for some of these shows. Now, Book of Boba Fett, for instance, right? We talked about that earlier on in the show. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is really interesting to me is there's like a cadre of people out there who are rooting for Star Wars to fail. And so they come out and any kind of like even remotely bad news that they can kind of jump on, they're going to highlight and they're going to scream it at the top of their lungs. And I don't mind that, because, you know, it's a passionate part of the fan base. But what I do mind is when it's objectively wrong. And the more that the critics of the stuff that Lucasfilm is doing wrong kind of point out stuff that's just not factually accurate,
you should demand that YouTube take those videos off their platform, or you will no longer do the Salty Nerd podcast. Man.
Well, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually like educate some people, and hopefully that'll be something that people can point to and be like, hey, this is the real thing. So, you know, I don't have like any like deep insider information. I worked in Hollywood for a couple of years. I you know, kind of live, breathe, and eat this stuff. I'm a big wonk for it. I like the behind the scenes business aspect of Hollywood. And the big thing here is that when people criticize a show, whether it be like, you know, the new Doctor Who or Star Wars or what's another thing that people are hating on right now, like Game of Thrones or whatever the case may be, they're always like, oh, it's a failure because the ratings are bad. And one of the interesting kind of side effects that has happened to Hollywood because of the streaming revolution is that the old method of judging whether or not a show is successful is now no longer applicable.
Okay.
Right? And Netflix, being the leading streaming service out there, is kind of the one that is setting the stage for the other streamers to judge their content.
Makes sense.
So one of the things that people might not be aware of is that ratings come from a company called Nielsen, one of those two.
Nielsen, yeah.
The Nielsen's rating system. And the way that Nielsen worked was back in the days when you had like broadcast or cable, they would go out and they would select people to participate with their rating system, and they would put like a box on their TV that kind of monitored what they watched and how long they watched it and stuff like that. And then from that sample, they would extrapolate, so they'd be like, we know that this household has this demographic in it and they watched this stuff. And so that must mean that among this demographic, we can assume that this many people watched it. And then networks would take that information, and based on how popular their show was and what demographic it reached, they would then sell advertisements on their shows. So a lot of soap operas that got, the middle-aged stay-at-home moms would sell advertising to, like, house cleaning products or, feminine hygiene products, like stuff like that.
Literally, thus the name. They started out when back in the day,
so
there was a corporate sponsor for every TV show. It was the soap companies.
Exactly. And so over time, people have kind of come to look at ratings as just like how many people watch something, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there were tons of ratings, then it means tons of people watched it. It was like super popular, super successful. But in the day and age of streaming services don't need to extrapolate. They don't need to guess. They don't need a third party to come in and tell them how good their shows are doing. And they don't need to sell advertising. Some do, but
must be nice.
Yeah. But they know to like the T what their metrics are. And what I mean by that is they know how many people start watching a show. They know at what point they stop watching a show. They know everything about your watch habits, and they know what your demographic is, your age, your race, like all that stuff. They have it down to a science, especially Netflix. Like Netflix knows everything about like what you like to watch, like how long you've watched it for, like all this other stuff. And so like Star Trek Discovery is like a good example of this, where people are like, nobody's watching Star Trek Discovery. The ratings are bad. Why hasn't it been canceled yet? How does it keep getting renewed? The ratings are terrible, blah, blah, blah. And what I wanted to do today is kind of go through some of the stuff that Netflix looks at to determine whether or not a show is successful. Because we got to remember that Netflix and all the other streaming services out there don't sell products, right? They're not selling commercial space or anything like that. They're a subscription service. And so their goal is to attract new subscribers and retain the ones that they currently have. Right. So I know for a fact that Netflix has something like a 4% churn rate, which means that every month they lose about 4% of their subscribers. Okay. But they also are so focused on attracting new subscribers. They got something like over 200 million subscribers around the world. And so they're making tons of money every month. And the way that they judge whether or not a show is successful is very different than the way that old networks used to. Yeah. And so I think a lot of people need to understand how streaming services evaluate original content in order to get their head around like, oh, Book of Boba Fett isn't a failure because, of these metrics. You can say it's a failure, but you'd be wrong because these metrics prove you otherwise. And so I just wanted to go through them real quick and kind of give people an idea of the kind of down and dirty numbers, and it might get a little bit boring. I'm just going to warn you right now. So if you want to jump off, I'm not going to blame you, but I'm going to go through this just for my own ego's sake.
Well, and look, though, man, I think there's some value in this if you're frustrated by whatever content you like to consume. If you don't feel like it's up to snuff, knowledge is power, and actually understanding what the mechanisms are behind the scenes that's dictating what lives and dies. I think being able to have mastery of understanding that is important. So this is good, man. I'm looking forward to it. Fire away.
Oh, well, I'm glad, and hopefully people will get something out of this, because let's face it, Netflix and a lot of these studios, they don't publicly come out with this stuff. Like, I had to do a butt ton of research.
Yeah,
to
I was
figure,
actually
to figure
curious
stuff
about
out.
where you were getting your information.
Well, oddly enough, a former employee of Netflix leaked some internal documents that talked about how they evaluate some of the shows, and there have been interviews with people like what's his name, Scott Stuber, who's the Netflix global chief of film. Like, he's the guy who determines what original films that they either acquire or make.
Yeah,
And in a recent interview, he kind of spilled some of the beans about like this stuff. So I wanted to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and share some of this information with the public, just so they know going forward. It's like, this is why these crappy shows keep getting renewed. So the big thing that Netflix looks at is a weird kind of ratio of how much it costs to do something like a TV show or a movie compared to viewership. And this ratio, the term they have for it is called the efficiency score. How efficient is the show? Like, if we spend $1 million on this
very
show,
dystopian. Great.
Yeah, if they spend $1 million on a show and it gets them this many hours of view time, then that was money well spent, because it retained people and it brought new people into the subscription service. So you got to remember that Netflix's entire goal is to attract new subscribers and keep them there once they're there, because they know how many subscribers are in danger of canceling. And the way that they know that is that they look at when was the last time you watched Netflix and how long did you watch it for.
Okay.
So they know that there's a certain number of people out there who haven't turned Netflix on in a number of weeks, right? They just haven't either had time or interest to watch it. And so they categorize those people as in danger of canceling. And their churn rate of 4%, that's pretty predictable. And it goes up and down month to month. But for the most part, they know how many people they're going to lose, and they know how many people they want to gain. And so all of their decisions on what shows they're going to put money behind, what shows they're going to renew, and all this other stuff comes down to this idea of efficiency. And efficiency is basically a score of 1. So a 1 efficiency means that it's neutral. Anything less than a 1 is bad. It means they spent more than they got out of that show or movie. And anything above a 1 is phenomenal. It's a success, right? So as long as an original series or original movie is above a 1 score of efficiency, Netflix considers it a success. Right?
And this is their method of quantifying the show or movie's ability to advance those goals of retention and growth.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and it's basically just price compared to viewership. That's the dumbed down version of it.
Sure.
So for instance, they spent $21 million on Squid Games, right? That had an efficiency of something like 48. Right?
And that's why there's going to be a second season.
Yes. They estimated that the impact score of having that in terms of viewership and free press coverage and like awareness of the brand and all that other stuff equated to close to $1 billion. Okay, which is why the efficiency score was so high. Yeah. They only spent $21 million on that thing. Now, in contrast to that, the latest Dave Chappelle comedy special, they spent $24 million. They paid Dave Chappelle $24 million to let them record his special and put it out on Netflix. And that's like a 90-minute comedy special. That had an efficiency score of 0.8. So they looked at that as, a bad investment, which is crazy, right? Like Dave Chappelle, but it was because of the negative publicity from like, you know, his trans controversy and all that other stuff. So a efficiency is kind of like the overall general score with which they use to rate a original offering. Now, part of that efficiency score is another very important metric that people need to understand, which is called adjusted viewer share, okay, or AVS. So adjusted viewers, it's a way where you can't just say like, okay, 70 million people watch this thing, right? That's not accurate enough. So what they do is they do adjusted viewership. And adjusted viewership is a way to weight the importance of a viewer, right? So for instance, people who just signed up to Netflix, the stuff that they watch is weighted heavier. It's given more, you know, importance because they're fresh and Netflix likes to see what they're watching.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with someone who hasn't watched Netflix in several weeks, or the people that they think are in danger of canceling. If they come back and watch a show, that's weighted heavier because that's helping them with retention, right?
Right.
Now, someone who watches Netflix like every day, 8 hours a day, they're given less.
Who gives a damn?
Yeah,
Right? Who cares?
exactly. So they have this adjusting scale of how they measure viewership, right? So not all viewers are equal. Some viewers.
Yeah, I am sorry to report that my household has absolutely no impact on the programming decisions at Netflix in that case.
And Netflix's kind of range at which they look at is 28 days.
Okay.
So the first 28 days of the release of a original series or a movie or something like that is the most important deciding factor in whether or not they're going to spend more money on it.
Okay.
Right? So efficiency and adjusted viewer share is basically their two big metrics. So when you combine adjusted viewer share with the budget of a show or movie, you come up with the efficiency score. And that's how they kind of rate things. And the efficiency score is the most important internal statistic in determining the success of a project. Okay. And basically, Netflix looks at three different things in determining the success of a TV show in terms of watch hours, because watch hours is a big thing. The more time people spend watching something, the more time they're invested in Netflix, the more likely that they're going to be to stay or like whatever. So they look at how many people started watching something, right? So that's another metric. How many people got at least 2 minutes into an episode or a movie? So there's a 2-minute mark. Then there's the completionist. How many people watched the whole thing? Mm-hmm. And then there's watch through, where it's like, okay, people watched episode 1, but they didn't watch episode 2. Or people watched episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Or people watched 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then they didn't care enough to finish the series. Yeah. So all this data tells them something, right? And so they factor that into their efficiency score. So like if people are really hyped about a show and they start watching a show, but they only make it like 2 episodes in for the most part, that affects the efficiency rating.
Right. Okay.
So basically, Netflix, they place an importance on engagement measured by how many hours are viewed. That's how they determine engagement, is through watch time. The more watch time something gets, the more hours something is viewed, the more Netflix considers it to be engaging with their audience. And that's important because that's what's going to keep subscribers around. That's going to bring in new subscribers into the service. So it also counts rewatching through the metrics that they measure. So like someone who watches something once, that's one thing. But if they go back and they again, so like if you rewatch The Office like 5-6 times on Netflix, they're like, okay, we're adding more weight to the rewatch because that's stickiness, that's engagement, that's keeping people around. So the more times something gets watched by the same person, the more weight that it's added onto it. And this is why something like Star Trek can be renewed, even though it's not very good, is because you have a hardcore fan base that'll sit there and rewatch it, over and over again, right?
Mhm.
So like the more dedicated the fan base who rewatches this stuff, if you got like a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer that my fiance rewatches like once a year,
Yeah.
or something like that, that's going to have a higher efficiency than something that she watches only once and quits on, And that's also something that they look at when a new season comes out, where it's like, did people go back and rewatch season 1? So
Right.
that adds to it. So Netflix really looks at the amount of hours that are viewed and looks at rewatch hours as well in order to kind of come up with this metric. And one of the interesting things I found in my research was that Netflix accounts for 6% of total TV viewing time in the United States. So out of all the time people are watching TV, 6% of that time is spent on Netflix. Now, to give you a little bit of contrast to that, YouTube also has 6% of the TV watch time in the United States. So Netflix and YouTube are on equal ground in terms of like market share of TV watch time.
Those numbers actually felt a little low to me. And I mean, I guess they're not, but like I would have imagined them to be a little even higher than they are.
You would think, but when you consider how much is being watched at any given time in the US, between the two of those, that's 12% of all TV, right? And if you look at YouTube's metrics, one of their big metrics is watch time, right? In order to get monetized, you need 40,000 hours of watch time, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So Netflix and YouTube are actually looking at very similar statistics. Although, like they have thumbnails on Netflix that they test out, but on YouTube, it's user-created thumbnails and stuff like that. And so, like, Netflix is constantly testing thumbnails to get people to check out stuff because Netflix doesn't advertise their material.
Right.
Like they might put like a trailer out on YouTube or something like that, but for the most part, they just kind of try to figure out when you log into your Netflix account, what do you want to watch? And they try to put that in front of you. And YouTube does the same thing.
You are certainly savvy enough, Matt. I imagine when you log into Netflix, are you like me, like picking up when they changed the thumbnail and thinking like, that's interesting. They went with like a neutral background color and a very simple image versus yesterday it looked like a Drew Struzan poster, right? Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, Netflix actually
into that
released a study on what they did on thumbnails.
Okay.
Where they kind of talked about all the split testing that they've done and what they found works best. And it's interesting stuff like, for instance, a picture of a villain works better than a picture of a hero. And so oftentimes you'll like when you saw the Squid Game stuff, it was always the guys with like the masks and like, the shapes on the mask and stuff like that, as opposed to the actual contestants of the show. And they found that like, bad guys just tend to, evoke a stronger emotion. People want to like check them out. They also said that faces, like people's faces, tend to perform better than things or abstract images. Right. And people with a obvious emotion on their face, like, tend to perform better than people who are like stoic.
Okay.
And there are also regional differences. Like, for instance, people in Germany respond to things differently than people in the United States, and people in Mexico respond to things differently. So,
sorry, I was just thinking of the Mike Myers Dieter character when he cuts the scene of the guy with his face covered in ants. Ants. So the German audience probably responds to faces covered in ants more than other parts of the world.
Well, actually, the German audience, they said, responds more to
sprockets. That was the name of that sketch.
Abstract stuff. So abstract images tend to resonate well with German audiences. Whereas
that is shocking. What a shocking revelation.
Yeah, images of characters tend to respond better in the United States. But one of the interesting things about the watch time stuff that we were just talking about is, so Scott Stuber did an interview about Red Notice, which was the Ryan Reynolds, Gal Gadot, The Rock movie that came out on Netflix.
And that did very well for them, right?
Oh yeah, it was a huge hit. And he actually kind of spilled some tea about how they, kind of judge these big budget original movies that they have. And so, we're talking about movies that have like a $200 million budget, right? Which is A-list big budget movies in Hollywood, right? $200 million, it's kind of standard. So in order for a $200 million plus movie or TV show or whatever the case may be to be considered a success on Netflix, within the first 28 days, they have to have at least 70 million viewers on that property. And you need at least 200 million watch hours on that property to be considered a success. So it's not just one or the other, it's both. You need 70 million and 200 million watch hours. So if you break that down, basically it's every watch hour in Netflix's terms is worth $1.
Mm-hmm.
And every viewer, every person who's watching that is worth $3. So that's a total of like $4, right? For every hour that you watch something, you're giving Netflix $4, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really interesting because, you often look at these good shows that are on Netflix and they get canceled. And you're like, why did they cancel that? That was a great show. But like, if it's not bringing in the efficiency to justify its cost, then to Netflix, it's a wash. And so like they'll cancel it. In fact, so Netflix's goal is to have every show that they purchase or every movie that they purchase and put on their platform pay for itself, essentially. And so in order to pay for a $200 million movie, you need the 70 million viewers and you need the 200 watch time hours. And one of the interesting things about Netflix is like, so you've always heard that Netflix cancels something after 2 seasons. That's kind of like their de facto. That's the joke. It's like 2 seasons and done.
Yep.
And a lot of people get pissed at that because they're like, oh man, the show is just getting started. Like what happened to these 5-7 season long things? But Netflix knows that the first 2 seasons of the show bring in the most subscribers. So like if a show's a hit, you get 2 good seasons in order to help grow the platform. By the time the 3rd season rolls around, or seasons after the 3rd, it doesn't do much to retain new subscribers or bring in new subscribers. And so to them, ending a show after a 2nd season actually saves a lot of money, no matter how good the show is. Now, if the show's a cultural phenomenon, like something like Stranger Things or something like that, where the efficiency score is so high, that doesn't make sense to cancel it because it's getting people jazzed. It brings back people who canceled to come back and watch it and stuff like that.
Sure.
That's something that they'll keep going with. But for the average original series or like whatever, 2 seasons is the most you can expect from Netflix. And a lot of people in Hollywood get very frustrated with that because they're like, hey, we were just getting started, give us a 5-season commitment. But the last time they did that, so the last time Netflix gave a 5-season commitment something was Star Trek Discovery, right?
Right, because it was the international carrier for that
Exactly,
show, right?
exactly. But Les Moonves, when he was in charge of CBS, he actually struck a very interesting deal with Netflix, where they basically paid for 5 seasons worth of the show up front, right? For the worldwide distribution rights, not the US, but the overseas. Netflix is very big overseas. And they paid for that show for its 5 seasons. And it just, and I always said, like, once that 5 seasons is up, that's probably going to be the last. And they just finished season 4. The 5th season was just announced. And after that, the Netflix money's gone. So I wouldn't be surprised if season 5 was the last season of Discovery, simply for that whole reason, is because like Netflix basically paid for that show.
If I can stop you do a quick plug for the Salty Nerd show, I consume a fair amount of these industry commentary videos that I would probably describe as ranging from pretty mainstream news sources to some out there alternative folks who, even as I'm listening to them talk, I'm pretty sure they're full of it, but they're entertaining. And so I appreciate the flights of fancy they take because they do it in an entertaining way. But there are, like, you talked about the people who are kind of quite obviously rooting for some of these properties to fail. And so they glom on to a potentially negative storyline and they just spin it out to its worst possible conclusion. And one of the things I've always respected about you, Matt, and I was lucky that I knew you and I could go back to you and rely on what you say about this stuff, is that you are often, with the way you are reporting on this stuff, you're cutting against the grain of a lot of the predominant, like, conventional wisdom in the alternative media world on YouTube or on social media about some of these pop cultural IPs. And way more often than not, you have turned out to be right, or at least more right than what you could find dozens of clickbait videos telling you exactly what you wanted to hear, but it wasn't the reality. So I really appreciate that dynamic that you bring to the group that you guys have. So I really, it's one of the reasons why I recommend your show to my friends who are into this kind of stuff, because I think you've got a good balance and you personally bring a valuable angle in that regard.
Yeah, I'm the egghead. I'm the film buff. Like it's more than just pretty pictures to me. I have to get something from it. But we were talking about at the beginning of the live stream how Peacemaker is more popular than Book of Boba Fett and The Witcher 2 and stuff like that. And when you extrapolate what we just talked about, the metrics that Netflix looks at, and assume that other streamers look at the same type of metrics to figure out whether or not a show is a success or not, you can see that Book of Boba Fett, even though it's not, the best show in the world, I would be interested to see, like, because Star Wars has such a hardcore fan base. Even the people who hate it will watch it, right? Sometimes more so.
Right.
So when you look at watch hours versus the type of viewer, because I guarantee you that the people who signed up for Disney Plus just for Star Wars stuff, like, they haven't watched Disney Plus in weeks or months before, like, Book of Boba Fett showed up, and then they came back and watched Book of Boba Fett. And so Disney looks at that and is like, oh, all these people who were absent for a long time, they came back, so we're going to weigh their viewership way more than the people who've been watching it like every day.
That's a good point.
And also, like, these are short, short series, like only 6 episodes.
Yeah.
So like they're pretty much done within that 28-day cycle, right? And so Disney probably looks at all the metrics, and they're like, hey, Book of Boba Fett, yeah, maybe it's not the greatest show we've ever produced, but guess what? It had an efficiency of 20 or something like that. Like, we got our money's worth off of that show. The viewership to cost ratio of that show skewed way in favor of viewership. You could look at all the Marvel shows in the same way too, where, like, I think other than Hawkeye, I haven't really liked any of the Marvel shows. Loki was okay. But Disney can look at those shows and be like, yeah, they were terrible, but the efficiency score was good, and so we're going to make more of them. And so, like, I think people need to, like, kind of reorient their brains about how Hollywood judges success in the streaming era, because it's not like if you release a movie in the theaters, you can see from the box office returns whether or not a movie is a hit or not. With streaming, the ratings, the old school ratings, like Nielsen ratings, they don't apply. So, like, trying to talk about the ratings of a streaming show as to whether or not it's a success is a losing battle, because it's apples and oranges. It doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah.
So you need to think of things as, like, how many people are watching this? How many people are talking about it? How long are these episodes? And how many people are watching the full episode, but also every episode fully? And when it comes to something like Star Wars, like The Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, every single person I know watches every single episode. When it comes to the Clone Wars, there are people out there who will rewatch that stuff over and over again, right? So the idea that Star Wars is failing because the ratings aren't good, or because they're having trouble getting the Obi-Wan series out, or like whatever the case may be, is ludicrous, because Disney Plus has these metrics that they can judge this stuff by. And by every measure that I can see, just based off of social media, based off of the people I know who are watching the show, based off my personal experience, like, I'm not a big fan of Book of Boba Fett, but I've watched every episode, sometimes more than once.
Yeah.
And that's a situation where, like, I didn't watch anything on Disney Plus until that show came back. Right. So, like, I think the last thing I watched on Disney Plus was Hawkeye before Book of Boba Fett.
Right.
But there are people out there who, like, maybe they watch Black Widow and then they canceled their subscription and then came back for Book of Boba Fett or something like that. But
Yeah.
there are all these metrics that people don't take into account that Disney's looking at is like, wow, this is a hit. You know, like how much did it cost us to make Book of Boba Fett? $3. Okay. You know, it's like we got the volume. That thing saved us a bunch of money. So like there's just all these factors that people need to take into account. And when they're listening to other people make claims that, you know, this show's a failure, everyone hates this show, blah, blah, blah. They need to ask them to back that up with actual numbers. It can't just be like, oh, I have a source that tells me the ratings are bad. It's like, no, you're not evaluating it the way a streamer evaluates a success. And it's that efficiency score, right? It's how much it cost versus how many people watched. And you need to figure out how that works. Otherwise, you're just going to be spreading misinformation.
In which case, it's you or Neil Young.
Yes, exactly. But the best way to get people to change, so like if you want Lucasfilm to change how they handle Star Wars, you need to be factual with your critiques of what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because if you come out with rumor and innuendo and you come off as ignorant about like how the industry actually works and how they judge success and failure, basically you're shooting yourself in the foot because Lucasfilm is going to dismiss you. They're going to be like, these people obviously don't know what they're talking about. So why do we have to listen to anything they have to say? But the more accurate you can be with like your knowledge and your criticism, the more that you're forcing them to pay attention to you because they're like, well, they obviously know how the business is done. So maybe their critique of what we're doing has some merit to it. And if enough people do that, they can't ignore you. If it's just a fringe of the fan base, it's going around saying like we don't like this, they can ignore that because it's subjective, right? But if educated critics come out and say like, hey, we know how you're judging this, whether or not it's a success, and we're telling you that you're wrong, and here's why, then maybe you can affect some change.
Well put. And I think that's absolutely right. That's why there is utility in understanding how the sausage gets made.
Yeah. So that was about a half hour of me getting super wonky
I loved it.
About streaming services and how they view successes and failures. If there are any questions that you guys in the chat have, feel free to ask me right now. But Chris, why don't you tell people where they can find out more about you and your podcast and all that good stuff?
Yeah, well, so you can follow me. Look, you can follow me on Twitter. My last name's on the screen. It's just @Bukanani. I am not active on that platform these days. I have found it to be such a toxic, depressing environment that I have drastically improved my mental health by just stepping away from Twitter. The microcosm of the college sports fan base is just as idiotic and cannibalistic as the pop cultural world, that's for sure. But the obligatory PSU pregame show, if there are any Penn State fans in the audience, we'll be back on television next fall. We'll have some stuff out on statecollege.com and onwardstate.com in the interim. And you can download the Keystone Sports app. I'll be appearing on the radio here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania throughout the off season. So again, I know there's not a ton of crossover in the audiences, but I have a lot of different interests. I like to talk about a lot of different things. So it's always a pleasure to step outside of the college sports world and come and talk some pop culture with you, Matt. I appreciate it very much.
Well, we'll have to have you on once House of the Dragon premieres and we're talking about that show.
Great.
So Andre Enrico asks, how does Cobra Kai compare to Discovery in this efficiency method? So obviously it compares very well. Basically, there's been 2 seasons of Cobra Kai that Netflix has funded. The first 2 seasons were YouTube, right? And then Netflix bought it. And then they put money into the 4th season, and it's obvious that they're making a 5th season. So Cobra Kai's efficiency has to be high enough that they're breaking their 2 seasons and done rule. So like any show that gets more than 2 seasons on Netflix it's obvious that that has a very high efficiency rating. I don't know how much they paid initially for the rights to the show, but you can bet your butt that it's not an expensive show to make. And also, it's getting so much viewership and buzz, especially like I think when it premiered at the end of December, it was like one of their most popular shows. So like people watched that a lot within the first 28 days. And it helps that they're only half-hour episodes because you can just kind of tear through all 10 episodes of that like really quickly. I think Jude and I got through Cobra Kai and season 4 in about 2 days, 3 days, something like that. And watch velocity is also a thing. You know, like the more people
Interesting.
the quicker people watch something, the more Netflix is like, oh, they're really into this thing, right? And there are people who that's why the binge model is so interesting. Like the week to week stuff, which is like the older model of releasing content, it gives you a different metric than a binge model, because Netflix finds out very quickly what the watch through rate is on a series when you're able to binge it. So if they sit down, they're like, wow, people are watching all 6 episodes in one sitting, you know, that carries more weight to it than it's like, oh, people watched all 6 episodes over the course of a month or something like that.
Okay.
So I have a feeling that the hardcore fans of Cobra Kai just tore through that thing, just like me and Jude did. So same thing with The Witcher season 2. People just freaking. I even went back and rewatched season 1, so there's that rewatchability thing again, because that counts, right?
I haven't gotten to season 2 of Witcher yet, and I am definitely going to go back and rewatch season 1 before I do. So evident of your point. You know, just to real quickly touch on Cobra Kai, I think it's interesting. Somebody brought that up. I really hope that the lesson for Hollywood over the last several years, from the successes of The Mandalorian, Cobra Kai, Spider-Man No Way Home, to a lesser extent, I think Ghostbusters Afterlife, is that your audience are your consumers, and you should try not to antagonize them in the spirit of the Bob Chapek memo, right? You don't want to intentionally go to war with your target consumers, and it's actually possible to respect the audience and the IP and not like almost sadistically deprive them of what they want to see and still do good storytelling. Yeah. Like those two things are not mutually exclusive. And if you don't approach your customers with this sort of like condescending disdain, surprise, surprise, they will reward you with their time and, more importantly, their expendable income.
Well, you know what's interesting is, so if you know anything about YouTube, if you're a student of YouTube, right, which is, we on the Salty Nerd podcast, where we upload lots of videos and
you gotta serve the algorithmic god.
Yeah, try to get those sweet YouTube subscribers. One of the interesting things about YouTube is that as a content creator, you look at like, I need to get YouTube to find an audience for my video, right? Because we're all about the numbers. It's like we want lots of people to watch our videos and become fans and yada, yada. But YouTube doesn't look at the content creators in determining what they push to people. They're not trying to find an audience for your video. They're trying to find videos for their audience. And that's a key thing that streamers do as well, right? Streamers know the demographics of their user base, and they know watch history, and they know the type of stuff that you like to watch. And so they try to find stuff for them as opposed to finding people for you. And that's something that, you have to think about, because it's customer centric, right? The streamers value their customers because they want them to stick around. They want new people to come in. And so they try to find stuff that their customers are going to enjoy. Now, what we've seen in Hollywood in recent years is the exact opposite of that, where it's like, hey, we're going to make stuff and you better like it. And if you don't like it, you're an ist.
You're the problem. If you don't like this thing, you are the problem. And I think you and I would both agree, man, like fundamental to this stuff is that a lot of it just sucks.
Yeah.
It's just strip it of all the conversation about politics. It's bad storytelling.
Yeah.
And I think there's a misconception out there that if you do, look, I'm kind of lukewarm to fan service. Okay. Like there are a few too many original trilogy callbacks in the Favreau Filoni verse for my taste. Okay. Like I it's okay to see Treadwell. It's okay to see R5D4. I don't need to see both of them together, right? But it's forgivable. It's fine, whatever. I think the point is that it is possible to do these things and do so in a way that still gives you room to challenge your audience, uh, while respecting them and giving them plenty of what they want. You can combine some exotic cuisine with your comfort food and make really good, compelling entertainment. And at the end of the day, like, aren't you just trying to bring a little joy into people's lives, right? Isn't that the uh, value proposition of this industry? The why it's worth any money at all, because it allows us some pleasurable escapism.
Well, Chris, you and I had the advantage of actually going through film school, and we kind of saw like just a glimmer of what Hollywood is like by going through film school.
Sure.
And in film school, you'll know that there are people in there who come in and they're like, my poop don't stink. I'm the greatest since Spielberg. I'm going to blow up the world, blah, blah, blah. One of the interesting things about Hollywood is that a lot of people who work in Hollywood did not go to school or train for the job that they have. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're like a camera assistant or a cinematographer or something like that, typically you need to have gone through some type of training. You need to work your way up or like spend time like working a camera, know how to light a set, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
When it comes to writing, there is no qualification to be a writer in Hollywood. You just have to know how to put words on paper, and that's it. That is the only qualification you need to be a writer. And that's, when I lived in Hollywood, everyone was working on a screenplay. Everyone you met, the homeless lady on the sidewalk, she's like, yeah, I got a screenplay, So oftentimes what happens is the least qualified people who are the best at communicating their idea get the job.
Yeah.
And I was in lots of situations where I would go in. I like to think that I'm a pretty decent writer. Okay. And I would have like a script worked out, and I would have spent like a lot of time making sure that it was, structured well, and the characters were good, and there was rising action. There was all the stuff, all the beats you needed to hit to have a good script. And I would go in and pitch it to a producer, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that sounds good. Who's attached to it? I'm like, no one. That's why I'm here pitching it to you. Right. And they're like, oh, well, we can't make anything if there's no one attached to it. And there was actually like a little booklet that a lot of these producers had that would have actors in it. It was about this thick. And it would have a monetary value assigned to these actors, where it's like, if you have this actor in your movie, it's guaranteed to bring in at least this much money. Right? So someone like, at the time, like Mel Gibson, right? His value was like $20 million. So if you had Mel Gibson in your movie, you were guaranteed to make $20 million.
Okay.
Now, most people, one of the things I learned working in Hollywood is that you're basically a professional beggar, right? You have to go to the people with the money and convince them to give you that money to make your movie.
Yeah.
And it was a soul crushing thing to try to, basically, you just have to go and beg them to let you have money so you could realize your vision, right? And oftentimes it was so hard to get that money that, like, unless you had money and people attached to a project, it wouldn't get made. But
Sure.
you could have like Mel Gibson's trainer, right? His gym trainer, write a script and get a letter of intent from Mel saying like, yeah, if you get money for it, I'll be in it. And then have his uncle put up $10,000, and he'd go to a producer, and it was like a 3-year-old scribbled something on paper with crayon, but it's got 10 grand and Mel Gibson attached to it. And they're like, yep, we'll make that. Because with Mel Gibson attached, that's $20 million right there, right?
Right.
So they can sell that to studios. But if you have a good script, but nothing attached to it, that's a much harder sell. And so a lot of times people don't bother with it because scripts are a dime a dozen in Hollywood, right? And so the big problem with Hollywood nowadays is that you don't have people who actually take the craft of writing and storytelling seriously. You have people who go to Hollywood for fame and fortune, and they're good hustlers, or they're good at talking a good game, and they're able to get the job, but when it comes time to actually perform the job, they suck at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the entire Lucasfilm story group, right? They were diversity hires that Kathleen Kennedy, it's a noble thing to want to take people who don't usually get opportunities and give them opportunity, but their only qualification for being involved in the Lucasfilm story group is their race and gender. It's not their ability to write. It's not their ability to tell a story. And it's because of that we got The Last Jedi, and we got Rise of Skywalker. We got all these terrible Star Wars stories.
Yeah, and you may not love it, and maybe it's not even a good thing if you want to lean into the artistry of this stuff. But when you are a steward of the storytelling in that kind of a valuable IP, you are a business person to some extent, right? And so, like, not just the substandard work that was turned in by that group from time to time was problematic, but then the way they would double down on antagonistically blaming the audience for somehow not, like, it's your fault that you don't like this. And then the higher ups would buy into it. Like, that's what's created this feedback loop where you have the audience who's at the bottom. They're on the bottom rung of the ladder, and they're made to feel dissatisfied, disrespected, helpless, and powerless, and then antagonized for their powerlessness by dipshits like Pablo Hidalgo. And you wonder why you've brutalized your brand equity. Like, it's just super frustrating for me to watch, and from someone who is, sympathetic to the audience who is frustrated, but certainly not in the vanguard of people, out there calling for people's jobs or whatever. And I'm just looking at the way this has been so badly botched and thinking, guys, it's not this complicated. It's not this hard.
Well, I think a lot of people who've never lived in Hollywood underestimate the type of bubble you're in when you're out there.
I can only imagine.
It really is like when you're in the industry, it's so encapsulated in this small town. Hollywood is a small town, that it's hard. It's no surprise to me that they would look down on the audience, because you have these people who are at the height of the industry, and when you're at that level, nobody tells you anything critical, right? Like they don't tell you suck. They don't tell you like you're horrible or like whatever. The only people who are able to do that are punching down because they're more successful or more important than you are. So when the audience comes out, everyone around these people says like, "Oh, they're just toxic. Don't listen to them. You're brilliant. You're like whatever."
Yeah.
And so they strike back thinking like, "Oh, I'm in the right here," but their bubble is just a small little town, and the rest of the world is the one that's right usually.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, not only is it a bubble, it's a total fantasy world, self-contained within that bubble. And look, Matt, a lot of these people, these are psychologically fragile human beings with massive complexes and fragilities. And one thing I can find some sympathy with is that if you are in any form of media and you are putting yourself out there to talk about something people have strong opinions and intense emotional investment in, Twitter and Facebook allow you to hear directly from people who will tell you what a moron and what a scumbag and how dumb you are on a regular basis. And if you combine that with some masked personal insecurities, like, I totally understand how you can quickly develop disdain for your audience and start lashing back out at them. And, you just can't do it. You can't do it. Like, at the end of the day, you have to understand that you serve at their pleasure. It is the commitment and devotion of these people, whether you imagine that you like them or not. And I say imagine because social media doesn't allow us to truly know anybody. You just got to roll with it. And again, the very best people who are having, I think, the most success right now have figured out that sadistically antagonizing the audience and depriving them of what they want is not a recipe for success. And it's possible to not do that and still do storytelling with integrity.
Yeah, and also Hollywood is such a relationship based industry. Like merit has very little to do with success in Hollywood. It's all about who you know, and it's about how much they like you.
Mhm.
And so like you have people who are very personable, they're very engaging, they're like super smooth talkers, they're funny, they're interesting, um, and people like them, and so they give them work, and then like they deliver a substandard product or they act out badly. I think a great example of this is Tim Burton. So like if you listen to Tim Burton talk, like he paints a picture for you for his vision, right?
Mhm.
I can remember it was actually like when I was living with you. Like I watched the audio commentary for Planet of the Apes with Mark Wahlberg, right? And the audio commentary by Tim Burton was fascinating. He gave you insights into his thought process, why he chose to shoot things this way and that. And I was like, wow, this is a good movie. And then I rewatch it without the
It is not.
commentary, and I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
this is a terrible movie.
Yeah, that movie stinks.
So Tim Burton's a great example of a director who, yeah, he has a vision and he's very personable and he can sell people on his vision. But at the end of the day, he doesn't make very good movies.
Yeah.
Like, I think I can count on one hand the number of movies of his that I've liked. So like Hollywood, like when you extrapolate that, that's everyone in Hollywood pretty much. Very few people actually get to where they are based off of their own talent, right? They're always propped up by something else, and so it is what it is, and it's probably not going to change anytime soon. And politics always makes it a lot more nasty than it has to be. Anyway, we've talked long enough about this stuff. I want to thank everyone who came up for the chat. I think we got up to like 20 viewers at some point, which is a lot of fun. Guys, thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate you coming out tonight and joining us on this live stream. And this is something that I'm experimenting with in terms of like the format of doing news. And we're probably going to go and clip each news segment, release it as its own video so people don't have to sit through like 2.5 hours of stuff. But let us know what you thought about it. Give us a thumbs up on the video. That helps us out with the algorithm. And if you're not subscribed, please do. And please tell just one person to come check out our channel and subscribe, because we really want to get that tattoo on Matt Vader's butt.
July 4th. It's
July
a hard
4th,
deadline.
It is a hard deadline. And he said if it's 9,999, he's not doing it. So we really need to hunker down, focus, and make this happen.
Have you established the amount of real estate on the ass that's going to be occupied by this tattoo?
Yes.
Okay.
He said no bigger than this.
Well, see, what you got to think about is, if you'll forgive the expression, some stretch goals, where if you can get, if you could get to 15,000, you'll increase the size of the tattoo by X amount of
That's not a bad idea.
square inches.
I'll run it by him. I'll see if he goes for it. All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. And tune in on Saturday morning, where we do the Salty Nerd Saturday morning. It's me, Matt Vader, and hopefully Danny the Dork Knight will be able to join us this weekend. And as always, stay salty, my friends.